What do you think of when you think of a master prepper? I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you don't think of this guy. And yet, we have a record of an exchange that took place between this man and his disciples, wherein he gives the perfect advice to prepare for any collapse scenario. And today, we're going to look at that advice and see just what we can learn from it. We've started our series, Grading the Graders. As it continues, you'll see a core theme where we daub our doomsday preppers for a kind of giving a man a fish versus teaching a man to fish mistake. Sure, they may have a stockpile of food and a group of heavily armed people to protect it, but is that group of people an actual community? Do they have a higher purpose than merely surviving? When actual collapse comes, you're going to see all sorts of people who never built up any stockpiles, have no bug-out vehicles or anything like that, but who still come out okay, relatively, because they had the right mindset. And 2,000 years ago, we see the perfect lesson on just this subject. The founder of the Christian religion, Jesus of Nazareth, had just left the Hebrew capital of Jerusalem. While there, he is recorded as having made the statement that Herod's temple, the rebuilt and enlarged version of Solomon's temple, was going to be destroyed. That temple was the center of the Hebrews' identity as God's chosen people, and this statement would have been awfully distressing for his Hebrew disciples. So they asked him point blank, when is this going to happen? And ever since, scholars who study this stuff have been trying to shoehorn his answer into the give-a-fish mode of when do we get ready for the end of the world. But that's not what he was saying. His answer was firmly rooted in the teach-to-fish mode of a set of protocols that provide an absolute masterclass on how to approach collapse, including an amazing answer on how to recognize when collapse is imminent. Now, let's get started.
And the whore of Babylon shall ride forth on a three-headed serpent, and throughout the land shall be a great rubbing of pots.
Of course, he goes on to say, for many will come in my name. And that's exactly what happened. There's a spoof of this in Monty Python's Life of Brian, which you can discount as just comedy, but the Monty Python team met at Cambridge, and they knew how to do research. Look on Wikipedia, and it mentions 7 people who claimed to be Messiah in the 1st century A.D., but I did a paper on this back in college, and I came up with almost 40, practically tripping over each other, just like in this scene. And don't get hung up on the religion. This is a basic principle that applies for any state that is going into a period of decadence and decline. Why is it happening? It's happening because the culture has turned from the worldview, so the basic set of assumptions they held about the world and their place in it, that allowed them to build up their nation state to a level of power and prominence, and turned to a worldview that is causing their nation to enter a state of terminal collapse. We could spend all day looking at examples of how the Western world is currently declining. For now, I'll just give one metaphor that I think strikes at the heart of this change, and we're going to stick with our Christian theme here. If you take a hymnal from the earlier centuries and you look at the words, you'll see song after song of people singing about God's greatness, so lifting up the idea of a higher power, and that this higher power is benevolent. This idea of something higher and more perfect than ourselves was intrinsic to the idea of America striving for a more perfect union. Now, if you look at the lyrics of the current top 40 popular Christian songs, you'll see one after the next, reversing this, and having God sing about the wonders and amazement of mankind. This remarkable change in values is at the very foundation of our current problems, and has us simply tearing through centuries of cultural norms because we no longer think that we need those norms, because we're just so incredible. Statement 1 says, watch what your teachers are teaching. Take it all with a grain of salt. Collapsing societies always come with unhealthy principles being taught by their elites. And the first step in surviving collapse is not to get caught up in the nonsense. There's a line from Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises that goes, "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. 2 ways, Mike said. Gradually and then suddenly. The prepper version of that is, how does collapse happen? Slowly, then suddenly, all at once. There's a slew of people who've already gone into hiding. And other than maybe just getting used to that kind of life, there's no value in that. No, the pandemic is not going to end the world as we know it. And no, even as contentious as our current political climate is, we're not about to have a civil war. These aren't socialists as the 20th century understood socialism. These are just people who want stuff they haven't worked for. And there's plenty of people on both sides of the political aisle who fit this category. And guess what? There's nothing new about thought police. Yeah, we call these things witch hunts for a reason. In the early 1600s, the town of Würzburg in modern-day Germany practically depopulated itself, with all the people denouncing each other as witches and the mass executions that followed. The ultimate in cancel culture, they burned somewhere around 30% of the entire population of the area, 1 in 3, even young children. But why does it get so intense during this time? The answer is because during times of collapse, the social fabric is tearing apart, meaning that the disaster is telescoping from collapse of relationships to the collapse of communities to the collapse of nations. In the first century, it seems that the desire of the Hebrews to be rid of the Romans was reaching a fever pitch. And this would have spread all kinds of discord, because a lot of the Hebrews had become heavily influenced by Roman society. For anyone familiar with the Bible, this is the difference between Pharisee and Sadducee. The Pharisees were the traditionalists, and the Sadducees were the Greco-Roman influenced. And in the first century Palestine, the Messiah of the hour, Simon Bar Giora, and his followers were killing people left and right, probably mostly for their Roman sympathies, and I'm sure along the way enriching themselves and taking out a political opponent or two. Now, there's just too many examples. I don't know where to begin. But at least a mention should be made of the breakdown crucial to all relationships in any society, the marriage relationship. Of course, marriage rates in the West have been plummeting in recent years. And we all know why, internet pornography and the breakdown of traditional gender roles being the biggest ones. Just take an example to show how different things have gotten. This article showed up in my feed a few days ago. I've never watched her show and I didn't watch her little rant, but here's my point. This gal's 27. Look at her. I mean, minus the guess where I'm about to stick this microphone look on her face right now. Imagine it's 1955. How many crew-cut, leather jacket-wearing guys do you think would have shown up at her door hoping to put a ring on her finger? Next question. If it was 1955, what do you think the odds are that she would have been married in or even before college? And so, not ranting about the evils of men collectively, but talking about her husband, her children, her family, etc., etc. And don't think she would have been ranting about her husband either. That's one of the misconceptions that got us into this current mess. No, it turns out that couples that experience the highest rates of marital satisfaction and happiness are the marriages that are prearranged. Now, there's a trick here. It's not because they are prearranged. Prearranged marriages for a bunch of the Twitter generation, and you're going to get mass homicide, not mass happiness. Now, it's because the people entering into those sorts of marriages come from societies that still hold to traditional marriage roles. Husband as provider, wife as sole sexual partner. And it turns out that those roles are based on meeting intrinsic human needs. They just mesh better with our natural psychology. So once upon a time, divorce was really rare. And of course, people aren't perfect. It was never heaven on earth. But any honest comparison between the bygone era and now shows a difference between mostly happy, satisfied couples versus now astonishing levels of dissatisfaction that are only hard to measure because for the last 15 years they're occurring against the shocking levels of mental illness that now plague our society. But consider this. If you're married, or if you've ever been in a close relationship, or even just looking at close relationships around you, do you honestly think that relationships have grown closer now that much of human sexual needs are being satisfied not by the partner but by pornography? And much of the human need for attachment and belonging is being satisfied by how many likes you get on your dinner selfie? Or does it seem like we're all becoming background clutter in each other's lives, increasingly treating each other like objects simply because we don't see any need for each other? And relationships based on that dynamic are always going to be shallow and surface. Which brings us to our last statement. Okay, so this state of affairs can't last forever. It never does. So how do I know when it's all about to hit the fan? And to that question we get this answer. I know it sounds like religious mumbo-jumbo, but that's only because Jesus was making a simple reference to a well-known event at the time that concerned the very temple that his disciples were so worried about. And this is the story. About 200 years before Jesus was having this tete-a-tete with his crew, a Greek-influenced Syrian king calling himself Antiochus Epiphanes, meaning God in the flesh, parked his army in Jerusalem. And since he liked to think of himself as, God in the flesh, he was curious about this Hebrew temple, and particularly interested in a room in that temple called the Holy of Holies. A room thought to be so full of the presence of God that only the Hebrew high priest entered that room only once a year, and he did it with a rope tied around his waist or ankle so that if God struck him dead, they could pull his carcass back out of the room. So Antiochus goes into the room, and what does he find? Ever since the Babylonian exile and the ark went missing, they made a little movie on this if you need to brush up, it was basically just an empty room. Antiochus thought it was too empty, so he did a little redecorating with a statue of himself as the Greek patriarchal god Zeus. That didn't go over very well with the locals. The Maccabean revolt ensued, but that's not Jesus' point. He answered their question with a cultural reference. Today, the rough equivalent would be when the torpedo drops down the ventilation shaft, the chain reaction is about to start, so get ready to run. He's saying that it's not a shelter-in-place order that kills a society, and it's not umpteen days of rioting in one of your cities. No, every advanced society has a holy of holies. Corrupt that, and you left the slowly part of the show, and you're moving on to the suddenly all-at-once part of the program. Now, don't get me wrong, this statement comes with a bit of homework. We have to figure out what our society's holy of holies is. The one that directly impacted Jesus' disciples. I'd argue it was the ascension of Simon Bar Giora, either with the Jewish officials' blessing or just allowing it, depending on who you ask. But at the point he was walking around with a purple cape, calling himself King of the Jews, without any high priest pushback, I'd have been headed for the mountains. You see, they were a theocracy at this point, set up for religious rule. Suddenly abdicating that in favor of another human was upsetting the apple cart, and it did. Little historical aside, by the way, the disciples did flee to the mountains. According to the early church records, the Christian church based in Jerusalem did just what the passage said. They fled out Jerusalem through the eastern mountain route before the Romans encircled the city, and they escaped to the Decapolis city of Pella. And so were some of the only survivors of what was one of history's worst recorded massacres. In the late Renaissance, at the time that Catholic hegemony was collapsing, I would have hitched up my wagon right about the time that the Bohemian Protestants officially rejected Catholic rule by throwing the Catholic emissaries out of the top floor window of Prague Castle. So what is our Holy of Holies? What is the reactor room of our country that would cause a chain reaction if it collapsed? There's probably more than one, but an obvious one is our presidential election. And if we ever have one where the election is truly shown to be fraudulent, I would get my bug-out bag ready. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.